ministering, teaching, counseling, guidance. Each of these skills requires a clear understanding of professional boundary issues. In many ways, boundaries are not just an aid to our work, they are our work. Boundaries make all of our tasks possible. And yet, fundamental to understanding the complexity of boundary issues is the need to understand ourselves.
The amazing new invention, the Self-Care-Burator, will give you all the benefits of being a good spouse, enjoying hobbies, eating right, exercising, and more. All in less than 5 minutes a day. Perfect for the busy professional. Non-denominational, void where prohibited. Results may vary.
That means that our ability to be a person for others is only as adequate as we've come to our own sense of social ego identity, that we have a life.
Everybody needs to be loved and to be cared for and to be and to feel affirmed and valued.
It's not a matter of that we don't have personal and professional needs, or that it's more righteous to deprive oneself. If we're not meeting those needs, we're probably not very healthy. And that puts us at greater risk to be inappropriate or to try to meet needs in ways that are inappropriate.
When I arrived at this congregation, I think there was some different modeling that had taken place in the congregations past that lifted up the value of the pastor working longer hours and working hard and doing more. But there were some issues around that. They usually were expressed in terms like Jim's just not available. We're lacking some leadership in this congregation, things like that. But after a while, it was a long while, 10 years, 11 years, 12 years, then I was hearing different kinds of things, and the expressions would be how much people appreciated the modeling of taking care of one's own personal life, and particularly their family life, and that was heightened as a value in the life of the congregation.
The pastors that get themselves into trouble, it's because they're not taking care of themselves. The pastors who have a healthy family life, their intimate relationships, who play, who take time away, are less apt to get into trouble crossing boundaries.
I finally figured out the truism that the healthier my marriage, the healthier my parenting, then the healthier my ministry will be to others.
Or in my case, a Catholic priest, that it is automatically assumed, well, that means that you're a celibate person, and therefore I'm emotionally and physically and spiritually safe with you. I think that ought to be a correct assumption. But again, the illusion there is that just because you've made a commitment to celibacy or made a promise, the human factor is that you have to live that out. And without being aware of your own human needs, that you have as many human experiences and needs as any other person, that illusion can become a dangerous one then.
One of the challenges of this work is that everyone has different expectations. And the reality is that you cannot meet them all. And so I think acknowledging that and coming to that realization, the sooner I think a minister recognizes that, the more effective they're going to be.
And what I notice is that the more spaciousness I have in my life, the deeper my own practice is, and the better my teaching is, the more sound my teaching is.
One of the myths of clergy development is that you are available at all times to all persons. Kind of like in the military, anywhere, anytime, anyhow. Fortunately, we're not in the military, and we're not called to that. Quite frankly, my own model is Jesus Christ himself, where there are times when Jesus simply leaves his people and seeks his own rest, restoration, recovery. And if you look at the stories, you see him constantly taking off to do self-care.
We are committed to this notion of Shabbat. And while as leaders we are facilitating other people, our congregants, to having a full and meaningful Shabbat on Friday night and Saturday in the congregation, that We need that rest time to rejuvenate, to connect with ourselves, our own spiritual lives, as well as with our friends and families and with God.
I chose this congregation on a self-care concept. That is, I did not want to work at a 800 or 900 or 1,000 member congregation.
Self-care is a discipline that a decision needs to be made every morning when one gets up about self-care for that day, in terms of exercise, appropriate eating, and time for oneself. I mean, that's not a once-in-a-lifetime decision, that's a daily decision.
If you ask your congregation not to call you at home on Saturdays, except in an emergency, to help them understand what that is. So if somebody dies, that's an emergency. If there's a serious automobile accident, if the church is burning down, those are emergencies. But if you don't quite understand a piece of scripture, that's not an emergency. We can talk about that on Monday.
To live out of and act out of and speak out of the understanding that we're there to care for people, they're not there to care for us. And if the self-care becomes a significant issue, I'm going through a divorce or something like that, there's a sense in which the congregation is going to take some time to be caring toward me, but I need to really get my self-care other places.
For me, the most important gift is self-knowledge and awareness of our own needs. The fact that we are helpers doesn't mean that we don't need to be helped and that we're not human beings.
Every clergy person should avail themselves of therapeutic services. I believe that it's a stewardship issue because nowadays we understand therapy not as what's wrong with you, but as how to provide tools to equip you and to find healing in your own life.
It's about being clear about where I get my esteem from, not being too dependent on the people in the congregation for my self-esteem, being able to take care of myself on my own.
Again, my two questions. What's my role here and who's this for? If I'm having, for instance, a very bad day, I'm tired, I'm burned out, it's important for me to recognize that I am tired, that I need to connect with people, that I need to get something to eat, that I need to get some more rest, and not to come and inflict that on the people who come to me with needs that day, nor to go to them with my needs and say, I'm really tired out and fed up and angry, and can we just sit down and spend some time with that?
I think every pastor should have a spiritual director. And I say that just flat out. A spiritual director is different from a therapist. A therapist works with your emotional state and, family issues and how you relate with people and anger issues and all of that. A spiritual director helps you say, where in what's going on in your life do you see God's presence?
But you have to have somebody else whom you really respect, who could tell you something really difficult that you do not want to hear, that you have hidden away in you, and to whom you will go, oh, I don't want to hear this, but you're right. And I think that's got to be a spiritual teacher.
At least one other minister that, again, you can really be very open with about what's happening, and that you're not feeling like you're there by yourself, and someone that you can be somewhat accountable to as well.
I really have great empathy for my colleagues who are in small towns, rural areas, where you just have less resource.
Well, then I think you become ecumenical. Because then you go and you talk to the Unitarian minister, the Methodist minister, the Baptist minister, the Lutheran minister, the Jewish rabbi, and find somebody or the Catholic priest, and you find somebody that you feel like you can open your heart to, that you trust. You have to do a little work, though. You have to step out of, oh, I'm right, I'm a Buddhist, I'm right, and they're not Buddhist, so they're wrong. And it's amazing. You get the terminology straightened out, and you're talking about the same thing. It's the same job, the same issues. We're all human beings.
That as you go into ministry, your job is not to become a perfect professional, but to become a healthy human being who ministers professionally.
I'm sure there were a lot of red flags, but I chose to be colorblind.
I have had a couple of incidents where I've felt like I've gotten close to bumping up against it, but there's never been a crossing over. I was counseling a man in my congregation who was married and in an unhappy marriage, and I was single at the time, and I could definitely feel the conversation in my mind. This guy's cute, he's interesting, he's intelligent. I didn't do anything with that, but I was aware that, okay, I was bumping up against something there.
A teacher should never want something from a student. That's the principle. Should never want something from your student, except for that student to be himself or herself. When you start wanting something from them, when you want them to do something for you, or you want them to be a certain way, or to accomplish a certain thing, you're in trouble.
I know for myself a sense that I feel like I can't talk to people about the problems. And as soon as I know I can't talk, since I'm such a good talker, there's something else going on. I'm getting too caught up.
Clergy should be aware of is their own personal history in terms of their family history, whether or not they come from either an abusive or alcoholic family, whether they have a tendency to workaholism, whether they have a tendency to always meeting the needs of others and not being very aware of their own needs.
The places that we need to be particularly aware and careful are the times in our lives when our personal lives, particularly, that there's either a lot going on or we're in particular struggle or challenging time with family, because our personal attention is focused on the circumstances and our personal needs for support.
I think was very stunned by the fact his wife had left him and was hungry for that kind of personal intimacy that he was missing. And so he started talking with a couple of women in the church, just as pastor, they shared their confusion. He started sharing his confusion and pain and loneliness, and then it sort of just transitioned down.
One of the dangers I think that we make with that is to assume that people who are out of control in their sexual life or in their abusiveness to people that we read about in the news are somehow different than we are. And I think it's important for us to say that they may only be different than I am in terms of how much they have given themselves over to this more perverse side of life and become captive to it. But the same kinds of basic sexual feelings are also in my life.
Resentment is one of the biggest ones. If you feel like you're being underpaid and overworked,
you're not taking care of yourself physically when you're working too hard. And I love to work and I work long hours, and that's not working too hard. But where I'm working so that I start to lose perspective of how important I am. I think that the synagogue is the only place I'm supposed to be, and it's not. I start to think I'm the most valuable player, and that's very dangerous.
Out of believing that they were an exception. I'm not corruptible. And the people that I know who've not gotten into trouble seem to be pretty consistently people who remind themselves, I'm corruptible, and I need to have in place the factors that will help me not forget that.
When I think people are a Lone Ranger and they're not in close contact, especially with other colleagues, sometimes your judgment is not as good. I mean, we all make mistakes. That's part of who we are as human beings.
whether or not you're fantasizing about one of your congregants, be very aware of whether you are manipulating circumstances so that you can be in that person's presence.
For me, if I notice that I'm spending more time with one student than the rest, that's a danger signal to me. So I really try to watch my allocation of time. Or even if my energy is brighter and happier with a certain student, I just watch it.
Feeling like there are ways in which that you as the pastor can serve this person uniquely that another pastor would not, would be, I think, early clues that there are boundary violations maybe percolating or about to unfold.
As you've been teaching for a number of years, providing spiritual guidance, and your own, especially if your own spiritual life begins to wither because you're not working with a teacher and not renewing yourself, you become cynical and jaded, and you begin to wonder, is this really worth it? Am I in the right profession? And then someone comes along who's young and enthusiastic and so open and so receptive, and you want to pull that energy back into your life, so you want to go get closer and closer to that young person and spend more and more time with them. And I think that can become a problem, that should be a signal, oh, there's something I'm lacking.
Some might argue that being aware of sexual attraction is good. So to have the thought is something to celebrate. And the pastor, it means that you're open to it and therefore less likely to act on it. If you can recognize you're having the thought, then you can get someone to be in conversation with you about it, versus the pastor who has no awareness of the attraction, lets the small boundary violations escalate until they're finally falling into each other's arms without having any thought.
And then she started to leave, and then got to the door and then turned around and came back to me and just embraced me, just a full embrace. And all she meant by that was she was expressing the hope and the desire that our pastoral relationship was a healthy one. She didn't mean anything other than that, I'm convinced. What I had to attend to were my own attractions and my own feelings when this embrace occurred, because I felt she was attractive and the embrace felt good.
The pastor always, that's part of the power, that we always have the responsibility to say no, to set the boundary. It's not up to the parishioner. It is our job.
What I said is that I don't want there to be a problem between us either, because it's important to me that I be your pastor. So that framed it for her sake, but also for my sake.
You don't just suddenly find yourself in bed having sex. People would like to think that. Well, it just happened. We had a few drinks and suddenly we were having sex. But that's not actually how it happens when you take it apart.
That by the time you make it to the bedroom and you say that final yes, you said yes 101 unspoken ways along the way. You said yes to the intimacy. You said yes to the isolation. You said yes to the time of day. You say yes to the environment, the location, the type of place you're going to meet. You said yes to some of the fantasies that start to creep up in your own mind. You said yes to what if. So by the time you make it into that bedroom, it's not an accident. It's just a natural extension of a whole bunch of yeses that took along the way.
You're not the victim of, well, we just fell in love. The purpose of another person's life is not to relieve your own suffering. The purpose of another person's life is for them to develop to their highest potential. And as teachers, our purpose is to help them do that.
Anyone who goes out and comes in through me will find safe pasture. I never read or hear those words again, given the last 20 years, in both the work that I do and in the situations in churches, congregations, and synagogues. I never hear that the same. The first responsibility of a minister is to create a safe setting, that people can come and be there and know and expect and have a right to expect that they will be safe.
It's what you do. What you do is a reflection of who you are.
The call to ministry is a privilege. It's not a right, it's a privilege and a responsibility.
There's not a formula to this, to how to do this, how to navigate our way through the maze of human emotions and human relationships. There's a word in Hebrew, alavai. It should only be so if only there were that kind of a formula, so that we knew that, when we're making our way through, oh, we're not supposed to do that. Oh, we're not supposed to do that. And so, what I think it requires is that, I think it requires that we be awake and aware.
Nobody said this would be easy, but there are things that you have to renounce if you're a professional. Every professional has to give something up. If you're going to be a concert viola player, you have to give up playing baseball on Saturday afternoon to practice the viola. And as professional religious, we have to give things up in terms of who we can be friends with sometimes.
I love doing what I do. So when somebody tells me I'm the one at risk, this is harder for me, this is so difficult to maintain the boundaries, or it's so difficult to work as hard, my first response is, well, I get to do something I love all the time. So I'm the one who's privileged here.
The sense of call to the ministry is not something to be taken lightly, that call is simple. Go feed my sheep. Call is impossible. Feed my sheep. Call is something you must do to save your life. Call is something you probably don't want to do. And those things, I don't know that they go in any order, but you would hope someone would wrestle with those questions before they take on such a powerful role as church leadership.